Hello, Digital Void community, and welcome back to the Digital Void Virtual Salon series, where we bring people together to explore the gap in common understanding of digital culture, media, and technology. This is a space where we dive deep into not just the roots of our dominant technologies, but the forgotten histories of some of the most important figures who helped shape its development. We're all here learning together. How did big tech become an engine for inequality? What are the limits and possibilities for using technology to push racial justice? We're privileged to explore these questions and many more with NYU Vice Provost and author of Black Software, the Internet and Racial Justice, Dr. Charlton McIlwain. In discussion with Dr. McIlwain is digital media culture expert and founder of the New Media program at Molloy College, Dr. Jamie Cohen. Thanks so much for joining here tonight.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate the intro.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. McIlwain. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. And thank you for having the time to talk to us about your book and have a conversation with us about some of the hidden figures of the cyberspace past. It's very much a piece of my research. And when Josh and I were actually building Digital Void and we were creating the concept of this, your name was one of the first we came across that was like, we want to talk to you. it was a space where we're interested in like how digital cultures came to be. How do we get to now? And a lot of people now are very overwhelmed by the systems that are in place and don't really have the time or the privilege to actually interrogate the past that got us to this moment. And so your book, Black Software, is incredible because it doesn't just give us insight on the history of digital media, but tells an amazing and vivid story about the people that brought us much of the internet as it exists, but we haven't, either they've been erased or become hidden figures of our present. So one of the first questions I want to ask you is, can you tell us about yourself, how you, just because I know this is like oftentimes I've seen other interviews of you, but I would love to hear how you got to write this text.
Yeah, that's. I'm gonna try to give the short version because I could probably stand the whole time we have telling that story of arriving at the book. I started off really with a very straightforward and concrete question, which was, how do we explain Black Lives Matter? How do we explain such a powerful movement for racial justice that was in large part fueled by digital activism, by digital platforms and technologies that folks made use of. And so I set out to write that book. To do that, I went on a journey, and that journey continued long past where I had first intended. And that started with, at least having the sense to know things like this, movements like this, particularly those with such power and impact, don't come sort of overnight, and they're not made and come just out of the blue. So I figured at the very least, the roots of Black Lives Matter and what we might call digital activism probably has something to do with the 1990s, where the web came online and so forth. And so that's kind of where I started. And then it was just a series of finding people, talking to people, and every person I found had a story, and that story inevitably led to another person and inevitably leaned further and further back in time. So before I knew it, I found myself in the early 90s, then the mid 80s, then the late 70s. And at a certain point, I said, look, I'm sure if I let myself and allow myself to go back just a little bit longer to the 60s and to that moment we know was filled with so much interaction between civil rights and as well the kind of birthplace of modern computing as we know it, that I'll probably find something. And I did. And the culmination of all of that is what became Black Software, which had then spun into not just a story about how do we explain Black Lives Matter, but how do we explain the long relationship of Black people and their relationship to technology and the internet over this 50 plus year of time.
That's incredible. So I actually want to build off of that because very often the history of digital media, I teach a course called History of Digital Media, and the dominant history is written in a very specific and streamlined way that elides or omits Black history within that. And so it always, your title, Black Software, is great because one of your characters, if you could talk a little bit about the people you interviewed, write software at the very beginning. And that's something that wasn't really thought of in the history of digital media. It comes down to a lot of the very technical terms. You mentioned like the infrastructure itself. And here's one of the interesting things is that the infrastructure was exclusive. Building the infrastructure was an exclusive act. It comes from DARPA and then moves its way into the technological spaces. And your story illuminates the way some Black people were able to actually become part of the way that the internet was evolved, but aren't spoken about as much as they should be in the present.
Yeah, indeed. And I was struck very early on by something that like really just kind of hit me over the head. And it was looking at it's like an encyclopedia of Black inventors. I think it was something like that. It was written by Black African-American scholars all the way through. But I looked and found the entry for internet. And I remember saying something like, nothing in our evidence shows that African Americans or Black people had anything to do with the invention or development of the internet. And I thought for a minute, like, wow, that is a profound statement to make, that here's a group of people completely disconnected from, not included in this thing. And I thought that cannot be true. That cannot be, and it can only be true in one way, and that is, as you sort of mentioned, which is that we think about the internet very narrowly as infrastructure and the technical, the wires, the pipes, the hardware, the software, and that leads us inevitably to the wizards and so forth that we call them, that are exclusively white, exclusively male almost, and say these are the people that brought you and invented the internet. And so where my story ultimately began to pick up was finding people who very clearly were part of that story, but whose narratives no one had ever heard. And I asked myself, and I asked them often, you ever talk to anyone about this? Anyone ever write about it? And folks are like, no. Or some of the folks that were high profile and, built businesses and so forth sort of said, yeah, we were on people's radar for a moment. But other than that, time passed, and certainly no credit is ever given to those stories. But I was struck too, and this book ended up kind of turning into something very different from me because of these individual stories, which I fell in love with and had to, ultimately say, look, I can't write a book like I might normally write as an academic. I really just have to tell this story about, someone like Derek Brown, who, discovers, as a 10 or 11 year old, begs his mom to get a new computer, and he loves baseball and somehow discovers a spreadsheet application and falls in love with collecting stats and figuring out how to filter and sort and make predictions about who's going to win the World Series or the Cy Young Award or what have you. And that was an entry point for this particular African-American man, early 80s, who would ultimately become a very pivotal and significant figure when the web as we know it comes online in the 1990s. And so the book is really filled with those stories that I think are what are so important and what have been overlooked in this long history of the internet that we write and rewrite and always fail to recognize these folks.
Yeah, this is Josh and I actually talked about your book and how much we actually fell in love with the characters. We were like, and we were also talking about how as a text, it's not like its quotes are embedded in it and the stories are told as very much like the interviews are incredible. I mean, that's the truth in there, is because it has so much visual in it. And to hear the story, like Derek traveling, I forgot how far to go get the Mac computer at the time. And it was like having an actual mechanical keyboard, and everything we take for granted in the present of just having these things. And like
Right.
Apple now being kind of ubiquitous with culture, like digital culture. I'm wearing like an Apple like graphics shirt, and like it's just something that you don't think about where those things came from. And then we don't really think, and what your book works with is like, we don't really think about the people who didn't have the access or the entry points. And so Derek's curiosity for stats and like his Excel spreadsheet and all that work was like an incredible moment of like, well, what can the machine do? And it wasn't just like using it, it was like bending the way that it actually operates. And so that I really enjoyed the way that story progressed over time. It wasn't like something that happened in a moment and then was like, oh, okay, cool, I got to use it. It was like, I want to be part of it. And that was very cool. Like, how did you, when you're interrogating history and you're going back, did you feel like an excitement of finding like all of this like illuminating things? Like, did you like,
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So what was it like when you were doing the research to go to dig that, to do the archaeological work of that?
Yeah, it was fun. I mean, this is by far the most fun project I've ever worked on in my career. And it was really because every minute felt like a discovery. Like, this is just stuff I've never known, never heard of, never had any idea about in some way. And so every time, I dig into new material, whether it's an archive or conversing with, one of the characters in the book, it turns up something new that's absolutely fascinating. And so I felt always like I was on this kind of winding road, discovering something and then trying to find out where that came from or where that particular story fit in a larger history, and connecting this person to that one, and making a connection between what's going on in Boston, where certain people are, and what's happening in Georgia, and what that connection is, and what that connection is over a 55 year arc of time. And so that, I mean, it was fun. I will say, on the other hand, it was the subject of a lot of anxiety because, as you can imagine, you have a contractor write a book that comes with a moment where the publisher expects that you will deliver that book. And, and following these pathways, sometimes it's hard to stop and just write because there's so much to chase down. So that was the anxiety part of it. But it was a lot of fun, and it was a lot of fun mostly because it was a project really about people and their stories. The technology, while it figures in greatly, was secondary. And that, I really fell in love and connected with and felt like I was learning from people who were, in my mind, giants, and giants in this historical arc that produced this technology that is, of course, so ubiquitous for us all now.
Yeah, that's actually the next where I'm going with the next one. So I want to talk to you a bit about the message boards and the BBS and the communities that existed, because I do want to relate this to the Black Lives Matter movement of the present and Black Twitter, and how African-American use of the web was really community oriented in the past, as is in the present. But my work, I did my dissertation on virtual reality from 89 to 91. And the majority of my work comes from a message board. I think it's called Psi.Virtual Worlds. And it's where Howard Rheingold, like the guy who wrote the book, he kind of wrote, I mean, his book is kind of like chaotic and like just kind of spills the information out. But when you go into the message board, there's life. It was like alive in there. Like everybody, it was just so much information at once. I had dissertations don't really have deadlines like that, but I did want to graduate. So at a certain point, I had to kind of like cut off that. But what did you recognize when you were in the message boards? Did you like kind of discover anything about cultures at the time that should be more like, we should maybe focus like an event, like almost like reference that as a historical moment that is elided by modern history? Is when we kind of gloss over the 90s as like, yeah, the World Wide Web was established in 89, 94, browser was made, social media. And we don't really like think about like how much robustness was that, like from AOL 85 to like 95, there was like,
Mhm.
I know your book doesn't really go into techniques, but it's really, I want to like, if I had like a grad class or even my class to have the time to do it, your book supplements the idea of like, what is a TCP/IP? What is a message board?
Mhm.
They're all in there. It's just discussed in a narrative style. So can you tell me about like what it was like to find those communities, and did it is there anything recognizable or memorable that makes it show something significant to today in the present of that type of community?
Yeah, thanks for that question. There's a lot there, and that's, I feel you on the, I could have gotten lost in that small window of time as well, because there's so much there. And I had access to a lot of folks' sort of message board archives and so forth that were fascinating to just peer back into. But there are 2 points that I'll make with this. Like, so one was something, a kind of a finding disabusing me of kind of a principle or way of looking when I went into this project, which had a very political kind of orientation. So starting with Black Lives Matter and thinking about activism and trying to trace those roots. And so really putting a kind of political frame on what I would find. And so when I got to that bulletin board era and the Afronet and how people were talking and engaging in that space, what I found was they may have been interested in politics, but I will say they were a whole lot more interested in, let's say, making a love connection than they were trying to sort out the politics of the day. And so what I found was that people were they were interested in connecting. And that was the end all be all. We weren't trying to go and solve big problems and do all those things. And that element was there, don't get me wrong, but people were fascinated that here's a technology that in some very, I don't know, simple ways, meaning it didn't have the sort of technical sophistication that it takes to kind of seriously engage this day and know kind of coding and have some engineering background maybe to do some of these things. It was a kind of a low bar. People got into connection with other people. They could engage, even, text, which was still fascinating, even if just text. And I remember talking to several folks during that time saying, look, we ran up. I remember his name is Tyrone Foy, had a bulletin board out of Richmond, Virginia, that was part of the Afronet and some other networks, Black genealogy networks and so forth. And I remember him saying, what, this was so much fun. I got into it and I thought maybe I could make some money. He said at the end of the day, 89, 90, 91, when he started to sort of trail off, it's like, I look back and man, I spent so much more money than I made. And he said, I would do it all over again. It was well worth it. Yeah. And it was because it enabled a connection that was valuable, and just connection for the sake of a connection and connection with other Black folks. And so, your question makes me think of my good friend, Andre Brock, who is at Georgia Tech and also has a very great book out right now.
Yeah, we had him on 2 weeks ago.
Did you really? Oh, yeah. So you got
it. Talking about you.
Yeah. Well, and part of this is because this is the conversation we've often had where he says, sort of, look, we shouldn't go in thinking that these kind of platforms are there simply for what we can derive for them in terms of political outcomes or what have you, that they are there for pleasure. Mm-hmm. And so we'd had that conversation before I really had gotten into the meat of the book. And as I got there, I was like, oh, yeah, he was right. And that's what everybody was saying. Like, look, I got to talk to this fine woman in California, and I'm going to figure out a way to make a trip out there soon, and that was the value.
That was a great part of the book too, when it kind of goes into the message boards of the book weaves this history, because it kind of goes back and dabbles in the tiny micro political pieces until it becomes very political. in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things was like this anecdote, which was like when two people have a computer, they use it to communicate. And
Right.
then you notice that these message boards like show up. And that was a cute moment where it was just like, people were like, wait, I want to know where they went. Can somebody find this person that I saw in in this message board? And it was never a moment of innocence, but it was always a moment of curiosity. And so we actually spoke to Dr. Brock about creative misuse, is that oftentimes Black, Indigenous, and people of color, like the usage of the internet or the existing tools is creatively misused and then appropriated by the corporations. It's lifted out of those spaces to say, oh, well, this works because the next question I have is about content. I remember whether it was Afronet or one of the other devices, one of the things that presaged our current moment was this consideration of content. And it's like something that a lot of people, very many people in the 90s, weren't thinking about content as a product. They were thinking more of a communicative or attached space. And it's interesting to me because it's like almost like the book taps into this, where it's that could have been lifted to become our present day internet. Like that is something that is very clearly very specific to a moment. Afronet itself, the entire systems that were built, and now it's like, by eliding or omitting those histories, it's kind of like there's not credit given. So it's like the book does the work too of making sure we know that idea of content, which is now just everything, including what we're doing now, is kind of like taken for granted, but that started somewhere. So when you discovered that, was that like a shocking, because the reverse engineering of Black Lives Matter to this whole thing kind of gives you a sense of like, nothing happens in a vacuum. All these things happen as attached to something in the past. So what was that moment of like discovering those pieces that could potentially have been reused or appropriated by corporations today?
Well, it's a fascinating question. I think it happened for me in the story of Net Noir.
That's it. Net Noir. Sorry. Yeah.
David Ellington, Malcolm Cassell, and what you saw there, and of course there were precursors to that, right? Which was, here's the story of this thing being built and having been developed over a period of time that we call the internet. And for all of its life, it is almost exclusively technical in nature. It's hardware, it's software, it's pipes, people engaging and building in that way. When the time comes that folks like AOL and others are saying, look, how do we make money off of this medium? And that's, of course, what happens as we approach the 80s and up to the 90s is, we open up this space. The DoD opens up the internet in part to try to start commercial applications within it. And and folks start to say, look, if we're going to get people on this thing, how do we do that? How are we going to make money? How do we get
right? How do people even participate?
Yeah, like what is it? And what is it when the masses of people don't know what this thing is even? And so the beauty of saying someone like David who enters the picture and says, look, I know of something very old, which is called culture, and more specifically, Black cultural production, something that we know Black people love, we know everybody else loves, no matter your color, your background. And so that moment where he and Malcolm meet, and Malcolm has that engineering and software background, and a moment that crystallizes to say, look, AOL, you need users. You're not going to get it by having people show up and look at, digital reproductions of the phone book. You have to have content. You have to have stuff that is exciting, that people want to see, that people will stay engaged with. And that's around things, and it's around people. And that is produced. And so that moment of realization that was Malcolm, David, AOL at the time, and recognizing, it's about content. And so Ed Leonsis, who recognized, like, look, we're in a new era and we've got to sell this thing. And the only way to sell it is to have content. And so that was the moment for me to think about the significance of Black people and Black culture in the history of the internet. So yes, if you want to frame the internet as this technical thing, then you can have your heroes and inventors that look like the ones we all see in the history books. But if we're talking about the internet as we know it today, that had a beginning in Black culture. And so then to cut out that moment, and even a very specific moment that gets closer to where you began, which was Afronet thrived and they built a community in this bulletin board era. And as we approached the era of the web, everybody was vying for it. CompuServe went to the folks that built Afronet and said, hey, can you do your thing on our platform so that we can bring audiences to it? And that created a rift for some of the folks that were in Afronet, because most of them said, look, why do we have to do your thing? Why don't we just do our thing and we will control it and everything would be good? But CompuServe said, well, we'd like you in our space and we'll, fund it and obviously we'll profit from it. And so there was a recognition clearly in those moments of the power of Black cultural production and the need for that to drive the growth of this new medium.
That's right.
But that's, something we don't really hear about so much more.
No, and it's as recognized in the text and even in this, not just subtly, it's part of the structural inequality that's pre-built into the way that the web actually operates. And that's why I really wanted to make sure that we talk about on this. And also, like, I want to remind people watching on YouTube, you could ask questions too. Coming up, we'll come to your questions in just a little bit. That the reason why I focus on content so much is because to me, it was like, that is the modern web, is commodification of niche, robust, passionate communities. When platforms purchase product, they don't purchase the tech. They could build the tech. They buy the community. They buy the people. And it's kind of like, most people don't think of that. They're just like, oh, we're just being acquired. And it's like, no, this is the sharing public of that. And so when we look at origins of content and everything, it's like that, you kind of imagine that if Net Noir or Afronet were there, what would have been the impetus to create the modern web? And we don't think about like those types of gaps that would have occurred or what else it would have looked like. It's an interesting point of history. And that in itself is, we're going to move towards more political parts here, but that itself is a problem that we don't focus on that history.
Yeah. We think it just sort of materialized the way it looks now and not think that it had a very specific and deliberate beginning and origin that had everything to do with Black people and Black culture.
Mm-hmm. And of course, being the structural inequality of the system. And so your book, one of the moments where the politics start leaking in is the moment of Silicon Valley and its cocaine problem. Mm-hmm. And then the crack cocaine issue of Los Angeles. And that was a moment where I was reading between the lines there. I started thinking about what a wetware hack was and what it meant to change culture by using product external to the technology as part of that. And it's almost as if the large thumb of power that comes with the technologies saw, as in a Foucauldian way, saw power being increased inside of places where it wasn't in the control of the tech Silicon Valley mantra, whatever that was, which today is very male, which is very white. I mean, there's diversity more now than there was, but it was very much a time where it was like, was there a threat? Was there like, did Silicon Valley feel threatened by the potential of a bigger African-American presence inside of the cultural technologies that were there?
No, I don't think so. There were too few of us around for any threat to be there. But the reason that this is one of those parts of that story, like to the end of the book, my wife was like, I still don't understand why this cocaine story is in there. And I'm like, it's staying in the book over my dead body, But because for me, those two things were so intertwined in an interesting way, if nothing other than the kind of metaphorical pathway that it helped us to think about technology and technological production and its impact. And so to see this sort of thread of Silicon Valley as this bastion of technological production, and then to sort of think about who is building in that moment, who is included, who's a part of that ecosystem, and mostly who is left out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then to see sort of the contours as history moves us throughout the 80s from kind of a focus on Silicon Valley and this new technological revolution that's happening on through what really starts to captivate America, which is in South Central Los Angeles, and then spreading throughout the rest of the world in the crack cocaine epidemic. And so for me, this was my way of thinking about, let's think about how technologies get formed. Let's think about how technology is imbued with power. Mm. And so maybe to do that, let's step outside of the internet and computing and thinking about something that we rarely think of as technology, right? So cocaine is a chemical technology in the same way that computers are computing technologies, right? So here was an analogy for me that helped tell the story of technological power. Mm-hmm. And the sort of the absence, the presence, and the very deliberate ways in which power works to preserve itself. Mm-hmm. And so as cocaine starts to make its way into South Central, takes on a very different complexion in terms of its users, and in so doing becomes illicit in a very different way than cocaine up in Silicon Valley in all the ways that we, of course, know. Mm-hmm. And so that was a useful way for me to think about this concept of Black software in a different way. So software, in one sense, in talking about Black cultural producers that produce content that drove the growth of the internet. But then on the other hand, software that was used and technology that gets used very deliberately to deal with threats and real threats to power that typically come from Blackness and Black people.
Mm-hmm. There's been, so I want to switch over to the origin of this, the origin of your text of how you started researching it through Black Lives Matter. And I think, to me, the interlude, it's not an interlude, it's a chapter, but the interlude where it kind of escapes the technological space and goes to the cocaine story is a very important part of this, because Silicon Valley is driven, I mean, it's not just a tool, not just a chemical tool for the body, but it was a tool for productivity. Like, it was like, and it was almost like made a drug, like a white drug that was like okay to do. And it was so interesting. And then crack cocaine became like the not okay, and then cocaine became communicavized and then weaponized. Okay. And so it was that part is important, because as we talked to Dr. Brock about, the Black body in physical space is a carceral body. It's in the threat of long-standing institutional racism that's built into the way the country operates. And so technology itself is, today, I'm speaking more from most using presentism, is technology and culture are pretty interweaved at this moment. But at many points in history, they were distinctly separate by access. Who can actually touch the machines? Who can participate in this? And you make a very interesting note towards the end of the book about how 1994 is different than 2012. They're different. Things you could say in 2012 probably would either not have been said or would have been said and then just not have proliferated into the mainstream. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the hashtag, like the idea of that tool, that technique. That is a cultural artifact that is also a cultural hack into physical space that now moves and interweaves and moves between. It exists as a hashtag, but a movement that exists in physical space. So how do you see like that the technology today being very much part of like how we interact with those that liminal space between that, like the physical and the digital?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that's the traits that I could see when I started to think about Black Lives Matter, right? It is that here is a group of people who marshaled a hashtag and marshaled other ways of mobilizing social media platforms, Twitter in a very big way, Facebook and others. And it struck me that that doesn't happen by accident, by a sort of casual user or even group of users who go into a space and have no sense of that ecosystem. And so what I could recognize was that there's a very real sense of both cultural and technological expertise at work that produce this. And so if that is the case, then one has to ask the question where that came from and where these people sort of developed those both skills, sensibilities, etc. And so that's where that connection I started to really kind of look. And I think that's where that connection is in terms of that earlier question that you asked about the sort of 80s bulletin board moment and the present, which is you had people who were very much embedded with how to create and sustain community, how to live everyday life, survive, have pleasure, thrive, and to do so by and in the making of community and communal bonds and so forth. And so you have that moment and you have that sort of as a base, and then you have increasing engagement of people with technology as it becomes available, as people have access. And, you know, here again, I think is that critical story of folks like Derek and others who are entering the technology space and the computing space in a different way than the folks who built Afronet, who had their origins in the late 70s and 80s. Here were people now, folks like myself, like Derek, who were saying, oh, I have this technology and I happen to be sitting at a Georgia Tech or at an MIT, and I know something about this thing, and I have access to try to develop it.
Right.
And so here I have that mashup of my impulse, my need, my sensibility to really think about community, and I have access to these new tools in the ways that the prior generation did not.
That's right.
And so those are then the people either directly connected or closely connected as we start to get closer to more recent history and Black Lives Matter. And so when you looked at the networks that thrived in places like Twitter, you saw a lot of young folks, you saw a lot of millennials and newer generations of folks, but you also saw folks who were very much part of that early 90s cultural production online. And those things fuse together when you have networks that come together over a period of time and interact in both real or in physical spaces, digital spaces. And so I think that that combination of technical expertise, cultural grounding in community, is really what sort of produce these kinds of things that are possible today.
Right. That, you know, I even think of that. It's what's incredible is that the longitudinal connections, like there's different communities, like, and it's like almost it's a sad story because it's like the longitudinal connection is that of the structural inequality that's built into it. And that's the sad and unfortunate part. It's shared. It's a shared experience between generations where I think people of privilege or access have not really thought of that. It's like, oh, okay, we'll just use this tech. And it's that movement comes from a combined historical experience of really bringing the past, the present together and recognizing that these things can't be quiet anymore. We can't be speaking about it. unbelievable that it feels like it never ends. Like we brought it up with Dr. Brock, Abed Arbery, and like that video that comes online, it's horrific. And it's like almost like it's a problem to the point where we're just like, we should never ever normalize it. But we're glad we almost have that longitudinal history to kind of say, keep paying attention to this. Like Black Lives Matter. We have to keep saying it, because if we don't, then the systems itself kind of like grow and bubble over until it's just commodified. Like it's just there. So it resists that. So one more question before we open audience, and anybody could ask if they have it, is in the history of digital media, how do we bring civic awareness like to students, to young people, to bring the idea of like how these moments aren't just attached to the present, they're part of a longer history. How do we bring attention to the actual histories that we haven't been really like seeing or hearing as much as we should be?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I would answer it two ways. And the first is, we simply have to make our students read history.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as basic as that, but it's, you I'm sure face it as much as I have over the years, that students come into the classroom with, their history in some ways extends about the last 3 years or so. So I think there has to be a sense in which we push people not to think just about the present, and to deliberately go back to the past to read what's there, or otherwise avail ourselves to the stories that were produced in the past. But I think the other is to think, about how students, and encouraging students for how they can help to produce history. That is, there are people in the world, and we all have stories. And all those stories extend the generations that we are connected to. And so thinking of ways to help push people think about the value of stories, the value of narrative, and to think about the value of thinking about a connected timeline that goes and extends back through history, and not a sort of disconnected set of events that have nothing to do with each other.
Right.
And I'll make a final point before maybe we go to questions and so forth, that this was evident to me in a very real way, a moment, I guess it's maybe a couple of years ago now, when I think it was The Intercept who had come out with a story, and that story is an investigative piece. And it was about how they discovered that the NYPD had been using or taking its camera data from cameras around the city, surveillance data, giving it essentially to IBM for IBM to use to test and build facial recognition systems that could identify people based on race and skin color. And so the point of the piece was, number one, this shit is happening. But the other one was the NYPD and IBM have been collaborating on this for 5 years, and we haven't known. And I remember reading and chuckling kind of at that moment, because I thought, yes, this is an overwhelming thing that has been happening for 5 years, but you've missed the story, because it's not a 5-year story, it's a 50-year story. Right. Not just broadly speaking, but a 50-year story of collaboration between IBM, the NYPD, and law enforcement to build technological products that have had the impact of further and expansively incarcerating Black and brown people. And so I think stories like that say, look, when we look to our current technological moment and thinking about the problems and challenges, we don't have to start at square zero. The problem is already something we've confronted. The answers are probably also things that we've also confronted and deliberated on at some point. And so we lose all of that if we don't think seriously about history and the historical connections and their relevance for us today.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. Mahab Ahmed says, hi, what do you think about the growing trajectory of public interest around data and digital spaces? How do you foster that interest while centering critical race theory and its intersection with tech?
That's a great question. I think the interest is great, but I think it's only good if we have that critical sensibility, right? So we have been enamored by the platforms and the power that it gives and elevating and amplifying voices, the data and digital traces that are around that can help us organize, let's say, or to help push back on power and so forth. But I think time and time again, when things like this erupt and attention to it, we fail to think of the kind of long tail implications about whose data does this reflect? At the end of the day, who is going to benefit from these things? Are we finding a way to think about including the people who produce this data? You know, the tendency to think and look out on the internet and say all data is there, freely given, freely open to me, but someone produced that. And it belongs to them in some way. And so does it make sense? And is it fair to just take that and then do with it what we will, be that for good or for ill? And so I think this is only good and the interest is only there if we keep in mind that all of this has a current of power that runs through it. And we must always ask ourselves, in what ways are our considerations of these new spaces and these data help to sustain or to critique power in some way?
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that is very, like in grad school, that was a lot of the work we did was critical data theory and then critical, which then led to critical race theory. But the problem I had personally with like my grad school experience, and not to be overly critical, except they did shut down my program, so I'm a little critical of that, is that it was centered heavily on tech and data rather than the ownership and like what happens to data, where does data go? And very often, like just to go back to the surveillance, like surveillance is a structural problem in general, and then it becomes even more structurally problematic when there's now like the acceptance of that, like the normalization of that isn't like people, it's become so much more problematic than it is, because it's just constantly being thought about as, you know, just there. Mm-hmm. And stories that I always try to remind students of is like how much data isn't thought about, like what is the data privilege of coders. And so I remember when it was like, I think it was the Xbox Kinect didn't have the ability to see black and brown people. Like it couldn't detect it. And I was like, that's like a type of privilege built into those systems itself. And then the idea of what happens to that data, like what is the thought and how much value that somebody else is designing for that?
Yep.
It's absolute questions. Here's another question coming up. Cindy asks, how do we begin to change the conversations about these hidden racial narratives in public education? Does it start at the top?
I mean, I think it starts from everywhere. I think it does start at the top in terms of thinking about how we can change these things and trying to understand the structural ways in which we sustain power as it is given. But I think the other is that we have to avail ourselves to the people and the stories that are all around us in terms of understanding the connections between technology and people. And, you know, much to what you were saying, Jamie, about focusing on tools, which is what we typically do when we think about technology. It's the tool, and we forget about the people and the persons, and that's in large part because that's where all of this complexity comes in. Right. And that's where all of the the other parts of the narrative, and I'm thinking about people who, people of color who have engineering backgrounds and who enter this space from a lifetime of dealing with structural inequality, as you were mentioning earlier, which is very much a different narrative from many other folks that are in the same position, same education, same skill set, same focus on technology. But to think about someone who comes to this moment of technological engagement and production from a very different vantage point opens up the need to interrogate those stories and those narratives. And I think, I think the folly in some way is for us to continue to perpetuate the idea that we can only chip away and change these things if the people at the top do something. And I think that's certainly there, but I think it's also incumbent upon all of us who are not in those positions to still be able to think about these narratives, these stories, and find ways to amplify and get those out so that they are in the minds of those who do have and exercise power.
Thank you. Yeah, those are excellent answers, and I have to agree with that. I think top down, unfortunately, we have these systems in play that are also part of the power structure of Common Core, what has to be completed, what's for the test. And it isn't just expecting or waiting for that to change. It's almost like we have to, when I was doing my research, I kept asking myself, what's missing? It's a question that we kind of have to keep asking yourself. If it's only one monoculture, then something's not right. There's something out there. The world doesn't exist as if it's just one line. History doesn't exist as a lightning bolt. It's the Earth. It's orbital, and it's there's so much we have to think about and interrogate, and it's a lot to think about, and oftentimes it's very uncomfortable to think about. But if we don't, then we can perpetuate these dominant narratives that really dominate for the sake of kind of selling books or constantly not you speaking about people from the past who used history to kind of leverage their present, and so it is a problem of the tech industry itself, but it's also a problem of knowledge. And so I do appreciate your writing, and of course I'll continue to use it, and Dr. Brock's as well. And it's important for us to continually change this conversation so it's more open. If you have any more statements, we're going to wrap up. Do you have anything you want to plug or pitch or promote, or of course your book too?
Absolutely, there is a book. I should have run out and got the copy and could show, but it's Black Software, the Internet and Racial Justice from the Afronet to Black Lives Matter. You can buy it anywhere that you love to buy books, and I think certainly your favorite independent bookstore these days. Give them some help. Buy a book from there. But you can always find me. I'm on Twitter often at C McIlwain, CMCILWAIN. And so hope you'll reach out. Would love to connect. Would love to keep talking. And I'll plug the book one more time, but not for the commercial purposes, but to say, if you want the sort of at least a glimpse into the kind of ride that I had in researching and writing this book and access to the people and their stories, I would say read this book, if for no other reason than to simply immerse yourself in a different story. These folks whose stories are present there will change your life, will change your perspective about technology.
I have to completely agree with that. So thank you so much. And thank you for being here and taking the time with us and talking with us. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Time goes back so quickly.
It does. Thank you again.
Indeed. Thank you.